April 19, 1987. A biologist named Pete Bloom throws a net over a condor on a hillside in Kern County, California. The bird's name is AC9. When that net closes, every wild California condor on Earth is gone. Not dead, but gone. 27 birds, all in cages, spread across a handful of zoos. The people who did this were not sure they'd made the right call. Some of the best conservation minds alive thought they had just signed the species death warrant. The question that nobody could answer was the one that mattered most. What do you actually do with the last of something? To understand why someone would do that, to pull every last bird from the wild and lock it up, you have to go back to what condors actually are and what was being done to them. California condors are not ordinary birds. They have a wingspan close to 9.5 feet, which makes them the largest land bird in North America. They do not breed until they are 6 to 8 years old. They raise one chick every other year at most, and they can live for decades. They evolved during the Pleistocene, cleaning up the carcasses of mammoths and giant ground sloths. When that megafauna disappeared about 10,000 years ago, condors kept going on elk, deer, and marine mammals along the Pacific coast, ranging from British Columbia all the way down to Baja California. By the time the 20th century arrived, that range was already shrinking. By the late 1970s, only about 30 birds remained, and their territory had collapsed to a narrow patch of interior California. Two things were killing them. The first was DDT, which had worked its way up the food chain and was thinning condor eggshells to the point where the birds cracked their own eggs just by sitting on them. The second was lead. When hunters shot deer and left the gut piles in the field, condors ate them, and inside those gut piles were bullet fragments. Not the whole bullet, but tiny shards, pieces as small as a grain of rice scattered through the meat. Condors were swallowing those fragments whole. In 1982, a United States Fish and Wildlife Service biologist named Noel Snyder began systematically photographing and tracking every condor he could find in the wild. What the census data showed was devastating. Between early 1982 and early 1986, the wild population fell from 23 birds to 5. The average annual mortality rate across those 4 years was 26.6%. To put that in concrete terms, a 26.6% annual death rate implies an average lifespan of roughly 4 years. Condors do not reach sexual maturity until age 6. The math meant the species could not replace itself at all. That data triggered one of the ugliest debates in American conservation history. One side, led by Snyder and backed by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and the major zoos, argued that the only way to save the condor was to capture every bird and build the population in captivity. The other side, which included the National Audubon Society at various points, argued that captive breeding had never been proven to work at this scale, that condors would die in captivity, and that you cannot save a wild species by eliminating its wild population. Some argued it was better to let the birds die free. The capture everything side won. The program started cautiously. Eggs collected from wild nests in 1982 were artificially incubated and hatched in zoos. Then chicks, then the adults. One by one, over 5 years, the sky emptied. The last bird, a C9, came in on April 19, 1987, at the Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge. The wild population was gone. The captive population stood at 27 birds, 14 females and 13 males, held at the San Diego Wild Animal Park, the Los Angeles Zoo, and the World Center for Birds of Prey in Boise, Idaho. Nobody had ever rebuilt a species from a number that small. Nobody knew if it was even possible. The first problem was not feeding them or keeping them alive. The first problem was the DNA. When geneticists ran fingerprinting on the 27 captive birds, what came back was not the picture of a diverse wild population squeezed into a small number. It was something worse. The birds fell into 3 distinct genetic clusters, 3 clans, and within each clan, the individuals were closely related, likely at the level of half-siblings. When the analysis was complete, the entire captive population traced back to just 13 or 14 unique genetic lineages. A healthy wild population of a large bird species might draw from hundreds. The Condor program was working with barely a dozen. Inbreeding had already left a fingerprint. There was a lethal dwarfism allele, the gene for a condition called chondrodystrophy, circulating through the population at elevated frequency. Chicks born with 2 copies of the allele died young, their bones malformed. The allele itself could not be removed from the gene pool, but it could be managed. Breeding pairs had to be selected not just for health or compatibility, but for genetic value, which birds carried rare lineages, which pairings would produce the most diverse offspring, and which combinations risked throwing together 2 carriers. The zoo teams built pedigree software to track it all, calculating a mean kinship score for every bird, and using that score to decide who bred with whom. It was methodical, slow, and completely without precedent for a wild species. Meanwhile, the teams needed more birds fast. A condor pair naturally raises 1 chick every other year. That rate would not build a population quickly enough. So Mike Wallace and the zoo teams developed a technique called double clutching. Remove the first egg shortly after it is laid, hand it off for artificial incubation, and the pair will lay a second egg. Do it right, and you can sometimes get a third. The species' own biology had a workaround built into it. Pairs that lost eggs early in the season would lay again, and the program exploited that. Annual output per pair roughly doubled, but producing chicks was only half the problem. The other half was making sure those chicks grew up acting like condors. Condors raised by humans tend to associate humans with food and safety, and a condor that does not fear people is a condor that lands on someone's porch, approaches hikers, and ends up in situations that get it killed. The solution the teams used was puppet rearing. Keepers fed chicks using a condor head-hand puppet, so the birds never saw a human face during the critical imprinting window. It did not fully work. When the first puppet reared, birds were released into the wild starting in 1992 at the Cespe Condor Sanctuary in Ventura County. The behavior problems were immediate. The birds approached people. They landed on power poles. Several collided with power lines and died. Some had to be permanently pulled from the wild. The fix came from a different direction entirely. Parent-reared birds, chicks raised by actual condor pairs instead of puppets, behaved differently in the field. In November 1997, 5 parent-reared birds were released in the Ventana Wilderness area. By late 1999, that group had recorded 0 mortalities and 0 incidents of approaching humans. In the same period, puppet-reared birds from earlier releases were still causing problems years after release. The survival rate across all releases told the story plainly. 76% of parent-reared birds were still alive in the wild compared to 49% of puppet-reared birds. So, the program rebuilt its rearing approach. Parent rearing became the standard. The genetic pairing software kept running, breeding around the dwarfism allele, banking the rarest lineages. The captive flock grew. By 1992, it was large enough to start releases. By the late 1990s, condors were back over California, over Arizona, over the Grand Canyon. But the sky they came back to had not changed. The poison was still there. Lead never left. That's the thing that makes this story harder than it looks from the outside. The Condor program solved the captive breeding problem, solved the imprinting problem, solved most of the behavioral problems, and then ran straight into a wall that none of the science could fully move. From 1992 through the end of 2025, 161 condors in the wild free-flying population died from confirmed lead poisoning. That's 50% of every death where a cause was actually determined. 1 out of every 2 condors whose cause of death could be established was killed by the same thing that drove the species to 27 birds in the first place. The program had spent decades learning how to build condors from scratch, and the environment they were returning to kept dismantling them. The mechanism works like this. A hunter shoots a deer with a lead core rifle bullet. The bullet fragments on impact, not into 2 or 3 pieces, but into dozens, dispersing microscopic shards through the meat and organs in a radius far beyond the wound channel itself. The hunter takes the hindquarters and leaves the gut pile. A condor finds it within days, sometimes hours. The bird swallows those fragments whole, because condors do not chew and cannot distinguish lead from bone. The metal dissolves in the bird's acidic stomach, enters the bloodstream, and crosses into the nervous system. One contaminated carcass can poison multiple birds from the same flock because condors feed communally. California tried to address it legislatively. The Ridley Tree Condor Protection Act passed in 2008, requiring non-lead ammunition for hunting within the condor's range. Assembly Bill 711 followed in 2019, extending that requirement statewide to all wildlife hunting. On paper, the threat should have started declining. In practice, lad deaths in California condors have not shown a consistent downward trend, and wildlife managers are candid about why. Non-lead ammunition costs more. It is harder to find in rural stores. California restricts online ammunition purchases in ways that limit access further. And a significant portion of hunters who already stockpiled lead rounds are still working through that supply. The laws are real, the compliance is incomplete. Then, in March 2023, a different threat arrived from a different direction entirely. H5N1, a highly pathogenic avian influenza, tore through the Arizona and Utah condor population. In 3 weeks, 21 birds died. That was 18% of the entire Arizona and Utah flock, gone in less than a month. Emergency response teams scrambled to collect sick birds. 4 survived after receiving fluids and supportive care. Vaccine trials began in captive birds by July 2023, the first time condors had ever been vaccinated against avian influenza. Through all of it, the genetics team kept working. Whole genome sequencing replaced earlier DNA fingerprinting methods, and it corrected the founder count from 14 to 13 unique lineages. The pedigree became more precise. Mean kinship scores were recalibrated, and the placement of each new captive-bred chick, which subpopulation it joined, and what gap in genetic representation it filled, was determined by its specific genetic value to that location. The current population retains 94.6% of the original founder heterozygosity, a figure that holds up against every comparable rescue program on record. All of that work, every hard-won bird and managed pairing, was building toward a single count. As of December 31st, 2025, there are 607 California condors alive on Earth. That number did not exist in nature. It was built, pair by pair, egg by egg, pedigree calculation by pedigree calculation, over 38 years of work that nobody was certain would succeed when it started. Of those 607, exactly 392 are free-flying wild birds. California holds 216 of them, split between a central flock and a southern flock. Arizona and Utah together account for 98. Baja California has 53. And then there is the newest population, the one that might be the most striking of all. 25 condors are now flying over the Pacific Northwest. Reintroductions at Redwood National and State Parks began in 2022, established through a partnership between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Yurok tribe. For the Yurok, the condor, which they call prey-go-neesh, is not a conservation project. It is a return. The bird had been gone from that coastline for well over a century, and the tribe had been advocating for its return for years before the federal program caught up. No condors have fledged in the Pacific Northwest yet, but the birds are there, soaring over redwood country for the first time in living memory. In 2025, 16 chicks fledged from wild nests across the global population. Those birds were not captive bred and released. They hatched in cliff caves and rocky outcroppings, were fed by wild parents, and they flew on their own schedule. They have never been in a zoo, never seen a puppet, never been weighed on a keeper's scale. 5 of those chicks came from Arizona and Utah, the same population that lost 21 birds to avian influenza just 2 years earlier. None of this means the condor is saved. The recovery program's own documents are direct about that. mortality still exceeds natural recruitment in the California and Arizona and Utah populations. Without annual releases of captive-bred birds, the wild numbers would shrink. The lead problem has not been solved. 9 wild condors died from confirmed lead poisoning in 2025 alone, with another 9 deaths still pending final necropsy results. The bird remains listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act, and the criteria for even downlisting to threatened have only been partially met. What has been proven is something different and narrower, and in its own way more extraordinary. Starting from 27 birds, 3 genetic clans, barely a dozen founder lineages, and a dwarfism allele running loose through the gene pool, the program retained 99.5% of the heterozygosity those founders carried into captivity. Across more than 3 decades of managed breeding, the genetic architecture held. The species did not collapse inward the way the odds suggested it might. The wings and bones of the title mean something specific. The bones are the pedigree, the genetic scaffolding assembled from 27 individuals and maintained through software and careful pairing and hard choices about which birds bred, with whom and where their chicks went. The wings are what grew from that scaffolding. A condor riding a thermal over the Redwood coast. 16 chicks that nobody put in a box. 27 birds in cages in 1987. 607 alive today, nearly 400 of them wild. The condor is not saved yet, but it is flying, and that only happened because someone was willing to take the sky away to give it back. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it.